Over the past number of weeks, we've had an opportunity to engage in a topic called Finding Me. Finding Me is a reference to finding that me that has been created in the image of God. A me that is, experiencing more and more of the presence and the power of God. We've had this opportunity now to look at 8 principles that have been outlined by a recovery ministry called Celebrate Recovery. And as I looked at those principles, I thought these are principles that apply to all of us. Not one of us goes through this life without some hurt, hang-up, or habit that could not be addressed and transformed by the presence of God in our life. And so we've been taking those principles and then looking at biblical passages that just seem to get at the heart of what those principles are all about. So for instance, in the very first step, we took a look at Romans chapter 7, verse 14 through 25. And in this text, the Apostle Paul, who by his own admission was a Pharisee that was, as far as his legalistic, kind of adherence to the law, he was faultless. He was doing all the things that he could imagine to do as one who really wanted to understand something of the righteousness of God. And the result of that, though, was it brought him no more peace. There was always this striving. There was always this sense that I just am not making it. And in reality, when he began to look at his own heart, he began to recognize, this is bringing a problem for me. And he writes in Romans 7, he says, woe be unto me. He says, who's going to deliver me from this body of death, this internal struggle that I have? And the answer, of course, is his faith in Jesus, who becomes a righteousness for us apart from any legalistic, keeping of the law that we could do. And so that brings us to our first step, which was to recognize I am not God, that I am powerless to control my tendency to do the wrong, and my life becomes unmanageable when I want to be in that driver's seat. The second step in finding me is then recognize if I'm not God, then God really does exist, that I matter to him and that he has the power to help me. And so we saw in Romans 8 a beautiful passage that speaks about how there is now no condemnation to those who are in Christ Jesus. And the exhortation then is for us to begin to put our minds on the Spirit where there is life and peace. From there, we came to a third step, where recognizing I'm not God and God is for me and is willing to help me, that third step says I am consciously choosing to commit all of my life and will to Christ's care and control. There's that famous passage in Romans 12 where the Apostle Paul urges us to present ourselves as living sacrifices, holy and acceptable to God, which is our reasonable service of worship. And to no longer be conformed to the pattern of this world, but to be transformed by the renewing of our minds, so that we might prove what God's will is, that which is good, acceptable, and perfect. And so we began to recognize that if this is going to happen, there needs to be this transformation that takes place. And the word there in Romans 12 is the Greek word metamorphomai, where we get metamorphosis, something completely changed. God says, I want you to stop this conformity to a world, and I want you to be transformed, and that has to happen in your mind. You have to think differently. You have to look at the world differently. And as a result, it says, we'll be able to prove what God's will is, that which is good, acceptable, and perfect. And it requires this conscious choice. We have to cross a line. We have to make a decision. And when we do, we find then that the fourth step makes all the more sense, because it's in that space that I openly examine and confess my faults to myself, to God, and to perhaps someone whom I trust. And again, we looked at a passage that in Romans 12:3 that says that we are not to look, we're not to look at ourselves or consider ourselves more highly than we ought. But we need to be humble and sober-minded in our own self-assessments. And then there was this passage from Timothy where Paul openly declares that one time in his life he was a blasphemer, a persecutor of the church, a violent man. And while he could own that as part of who he was, it began to also demonstrate what God was doing in his life and how the grace of God was beginning to change him. And that testimony that God would come alongside someone like the Apostle Paul led him to say, Christ Jesus came to save sinners. And so we're all in that boat. And so the moment I make that decision to follow Christ, to turn my life over to him, it's in that moment then that the Spirit of God begins to testify with my spirit that I am a child of God, and things change. And I find myself being open now to how God will lead and direct me. And that's why the fifth step comes along. And it says here, I voluntarily submit to every change God wants to make in my life, and I humbly ask him to remove any character defaults. Because now, if my mind is centered on the things of God, then all of a sudden now I find that for me, my own rebellion, my sin, it's always there. And God is saying, come on, let's do something about this. Why don't we run a different kind of a race? And so the passages that were before us began to speak about the way in which we go about living our life, the way in which we express all of our emotions. And we found that those affections, those strong attributes of love and hate, zeal, perseverance, all those kinds of character attributes that we begin to demonstrate, God says, can we take those and mold them more and more into my image so that your love would be without hypocrisy, that you would hate what's evil and cling to what's good? Because the reality is sometimes we just do the reverse, right? Sometimes we can find ourselves hating what is good and clinging to what's evil. And the fruit that comes from that can often just bring a great deal of sorrow and pain. We make choices that now we have to live with and contend with for a very long time. But in following these steps, you could see that there's this progression, that God is wanting us to submit to him, to recognize that he is for us, that he has a plan for our life, and that if we just walk with him, these things will begin to show themselves in our life, and we will live with a lot more peace, a lot more security, and a lot more power. And so today, I want to take another step, and I want us to recognize that while God's grace is transforming us more and more into his image, there is another step that I think happens very often in our walk. It speaks about how relationships could become so complicated that sometimes we wind up not talking to people for a very long time. We hold grudges. We find that we've avoided some because maybe our behavior wasn't the best. And so I'd like to talk about this sixth step, but as we do, I'd like to bring you through a number of passages so that it would become self-evident as we go through a passage this morning. The passage I've chosen to speak to you about today is found in Romans chapter 13 and verse 8. In Romans chapter 13, verse 8, this is what we read. It says, "Let no debt remain outstanding, except the continuing debt to love one another. For he who loves his fellow man has fulfilled the law. The commandments, do not commit adultery, do not murder, do not steal, do not covet, and whatever other commandment there may be, are summed up in this one rule: love your neighbor as yourself. Love does no harm to its neighbor. Therefore, love is the fulfillment of the law." You see, when you look at that text, The latter half of the 10 Commandments are what's being cited here. You look, it says, don't commit adultery, don't commit murder, don't steal, don't covet. Those are all things that we do in relationship with those around us. And those prohibitions were there so that we might live at peace with our neighbor and also live in a righteous standing before God. But our natures being the way they are, we find ourselves very often, ignoring the will of God and just following after our own paths. And again, very often to our own personal, demise. And so here in Romans 13, the Apostle Paul is reminding us again that the one debt that we have that remains outstanding is to love one another deeply from the heart. To see that in our life, love really is being seen in the way in which there is no harm done to our neighbor. I'd like to think of this as love is the dominant rule of the Christian life. It's the one thing that we will never stop seeking to express in the way in which we live out our lives. Let me take another little look at this for a moment. As Romans 13 clearly points out, that there is this fulfillment that comes. All these commandments summed up in this one rule, love your neighbor as yourself. There is in the Gospel of Mark a story of Jesus coming across one of the rulers of his day. Jesus had been engaging the Pharisees and religious leaders in discussion. And so it says in verse 28 of Mark 12, it says, one of the teachers of the law came and heard them debating. And noticing that Jesus had given them a good answer, he asked them, of all the commandments, which is the most important? The most important one, Jesus answered, is this: hear, O Israel, the Lord your God, the Lord our God is one. Love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your soul, with all your mind, with all your strength. And the second is this: love your neighbor as yourself. There is no commandment greater than these. See, just as the Apostle Paul wrote and tells us, let no debt remain outstanding except that we love one another, because all the law, whether they're laws about adultery, about stealing, about coveting, all those laws, he says, could be summed up in this, that if you love your neighbor as yourself, you will do no harm against your neighbor. And where did he get that from? But from Jesus' own lips. Jesus gave us a summary of a summary. The 10 Commandments sought to summarize and bring, to clarity the gist of what God's law was all about. And then Jesus reduced that even more and said, look, to love God and to love your neighbor is the greater of all these. So what are we really saying here? I want you to look at the first thing here, that love is what defines our relationship with God and our neighbor. It's not duty. It's not just about the religious practices that we get into. It has everything to do with love. If you truly love God, then it says you will love your neighbor. And if you love your neighbor, you are loving God. There's a passage in the scriptures where Jesus speaks about separating the sheep from the goats, those who are faithful and those who are faithless. And he asks them both the same question. He says, when I was hungry, did you feed me? Did you clothe me? Was I sick? Did you visit me? When I was in prison, did you come? Like all these kinds of scenarios are brought up, and it says that to the sheep, he says, you did these things for me. But the people never recognized that they were really doing them for Jesus. They were doing them to their neighbor, conscious of that this is what we are called to do and to be. And the consequence of that was that God says, when you did it to the least of these, you did it unto me. So our relationship with God and with our neighbor has to be defined by this love, which then is an easy thing to turn around and take a look and say, as I examine my own heart, as I examine the relationships that I'm engaged in, would I say that love is the motivating factor in those relationships? Do I see how loving my family, my friends, my coworkers, neighbors, that is actually an expression of my love for God? You know, there is a passage in 1 John that is very, very pointed. And it says, how can you say that you love God whom you have not seen if you don't love your neighbor or you don't love your brother whom you have seen? You see, that to me is a real gut check. It's saying I can play the role of being spiritual, but if it's not seen in the way in which love is defining who I am in my relationship with God and neighbor, then it's just not true. There's something else that's being said here then. Not only is our love defining our relationship with God and neighbor, but the second thing I want you to see is that love is to engage all of our faculties. Jesus says it should affect our hearts. It should affect our understanding, our will, the way in which we are engaging the world around us. My relationship with God that is defined by love ought to find its expression in the way in which I go about living, how I think, how I act, what I say, what I do. All of which now is influenced by this relationship that I have with a God who says I matter to him. That he's come alongside me so that my sinful nature will now be transformed. And I will learn to love God with my heart, my mind, my soul, my strength. But there's something else I want you to see. As Jesus answered the question, the text in Mark chapter 12 goes on, and in verse 32 it says this, "Well said, teacher," the man replied. You are right in saying that God is one and that there is no other but him. To love him with all your heart, with all your understanding, with all your strength, and to love your neighbor as yourself is more important than all burnt offerings and sacrifices. When Jesus saw that the man had answered wisely, he said to him, "You are not far from the kingdom of God." No one dared ask him any more questions. But you see, what this teacher said to Jesus is absolutely true. He said in this text that to love God with all my faculties, to love my neighbor as myself, is more important than all of the burnt offerings and sacrifices. And when he said that, you have to remind yourself that in that day, the revealed will of God was for the nation of Israel to worship God in a very prescribed way that included these burnt offerings and sacrifices. And so what this gentleman is saying is that the motivation for those burnt offerings and those sacrifices had everything to do with how God was at work in that person's life. Did God really garner that person's heart and mind and soul and strength? Were they really loving their neighbor as themselves? Because otherwise we could just go through a religious, ceremony. It might make us feel good. We sing some songs. We enjoy a particular kind of worship and its style, and so we come. We feel good about doing those things. But did it change your heart? Is your relationship with God being more and more defined by this love? Are you really demonstrating that to your neighbor? Because love is more important than our religious activities. It's not just about those things that we do if they don't come from a heart that is motivated to love God with all my faculties and to love my neighbor as I would love myself. See, that's why love is the dominant rule in the Christian life. It's a way for us to begin to take a look at ourselves. And the further away we are from that truth, then you understand why this journey of finding me is so important. Because we were created in the image of God. And we ought to be giving him more and more glory by the way in which we are living. I put two passages in your sermon notes today along that line. One was from the book of James, and another one from Peter. Both of these texts have to deal with the spiritual discipline of prayer. And you could look them up on your own, but let me just give you a little bit of an insight here, because when I say that love is more important than our religious activities, let's just take this one spiritual discipline of prayer. In the book of James, James says, you do not have because you do not ask. He says, and when you ask with wrong motives, that you might spend it on yourselves. You see, so here is this prayer that I'm offering to God, and God says, I'm not listening to you, because everything about this prayer is all about you. Rather than your prayers ought to be a way to see that your mind and your heart and your will is being more and more conformed into the image of God. And so as God's will is being laid out, that's why you and I, as living sacrifices, holy and acceptable to God, are proving that to the world at large. They see us as these Christians, and they begin to get an insight into the God that we are serving. So in James, when he talks about how your prayers are not really being heard, he says it's because something is amiss at the very core of your motivations. It's not me. It's not a love for me. It's not a love for your neighbor. It has everything to do with you. And so as a result, it says your prayers are not being listened to. In 1 Peter, it's even applied in a more bolder fashion. In a passage that deals with relationships between husbands and wives, here's a text, and it says this. It says, if a man doesn't treat his wife in an understanding way, then his very prayers are hindered. Again, do you see how if love is more important than religious activity, then you could give yourself to all the prayers you want. You could lock yourself up in your own closet and stay there all day long. But if we're not expressing in this relationship with God and neighbor these tenets of love, then it's not really having its effect in one's life. And we walk away being very, very much deceived. Now, when you talk about love, I have another question that I think might be very good for us to just think about a moment as we are unfolding this sixth step. With all this talk about love, sometimes people say, well, I just don't feel it. I don't know. It's like if I'm really honest, I'm not sure that I even really want to do these things. And so I put down this question, can love be commanded? Can you command someone to love? See, that question comes because it depends very much on how you define love. If love is just based on my emotional state, if love is being defined as a feeling, then it's kind of hard to come along somebody and command them regarding those feelings. But I want to suggest to you that love is so much more than that as we look to the scriptures. One of the very famous passages that deal with this is found in 1 Corinthians chapter 13. You may have heard this passage recited at numerous weddings. And it talks about love. It's saying the passage begins by saying, look, if I speak with the tongues of men and of angels, but have not love, I am nothing more than a resounding gong and a clanging cymbal. In other words, I'm just making a whole lot of noise. And then it goes on and says, well, look, let me tell you what love is. And it says love is patient and love is kind. It does not envy. It does not boast. It's not proud. Love is not rude. It's not self-seeking. It's not easily angered. It keeps no record of wrongs. Love does not delight in evil, but rejoices with the truth. It always protects, always trusts, always hopes, always perseveres. Love never fails. You take a look at this text and now think about how this text here is expressed in everyday relationships, where love now is seen much more than just a sentiment. Love is more than just how I feel about things, because I may not feel patient. I may not feel kind. In fact, if I am honest with myself, there are times that I feel pretty envious and boastful and proud. In fact, sometimes my emotional state may lead me to a place where I am rather rude and self-seeking, and I am easily angered. And as far as keeping no record of wrongs, there are some that perhaps have a long list of all the things that people have done against them. And they review that list on occasion, and it just fans into flame these feelings. But you see, what I want you to realize that is that the Bible is declaring to us that love is much more than sentiment. Love is expressed in our actions. Because love here is expressed as a verb. Love is patient. And love, it says, is kind. It doesn't envy. It doesn't boast. It's not proud. It's not rude. It's not self-seeking. Those are things that we are doing and expressing. I could make a conscious choice. And I could say to myself, I am not going to keep a record of wrongs, because only if I continue to do that, all it's going to do is fan into flame this bitterness in my heart, and it's going to consume me. I am not going to look at people's failings and then use that as a basis upon which I am going to respond to them. Rather, I am allowing this love of God that has been poured out into my heart to be expressed more and more as I learn to love God with all my heart, mind, soul, and strength, and then love my neighbor as myself. See, if I do that, I become more and more conformed into the image of Jesus. Because didn't Jesus live his life like that? Jesus, though he was God, put up with all kinds of injustices, but he didn't pay evil for evil. He returned evil with good. And so what you see in our text then is, if love is the dominant rule of my life as a Christian, it can't help but begin to influence the way in which not only my relationship with God increases, but the way in which my relationship with my neighbor begins to broaden and deepen. And as long as it depends upon me, I am being called to live at peace with all men. And the moment I begin to find this, my back getting raised, or I become a little hard here, I just have to remember that Jesus died for me, that I need reformation, I need transformation. I am not God, and God has already declared what his good, acceptable, and perfect will is, and that is so that my love would be sincere. And I would hate what's evil and cling to what's good. See, love is not just sentiment. Love is expressed in actions. And one other thing, going all the way back to our first text that began this discussion, it said in our text, let no debt remain outstanding except the continuing debt to love one another, for he who loves his fellow man has fulfilled the law. You know, one other thing that I want you to see is that love, it's more than sentiment. Love is expressed in action, and love acts for the good of the other. You see, in the text, when it said fellow man, the word there is really the other. God says your love should do no harm to your neighbor. The positive of that is I'm to love my neighbor as myself. And sometimes those things are hard to do, right? Because when we are engaged in relationships, people act in unseemly ways. They can say some hurtful things. They can take advantage of a friendship. They act in ways that tear people down rather than build them up. It seems that these words that we use sometimes they leave deep scars, and there are hurts that last for a very, very long time. And if that's happened to you in your life, then no one needs to convince you. You know exactly how difficult that is. Maybe you live and these kinds of things have taken place in your family, and you can see how siblings have, well, they don't have a relationship anymore. Parents with their kids, or neighbors, one with the other. Now, I realize that we live in a broken world, so these things are going to happen. But the scripture is clear. It says, as much as it depends on you, then we need to live differently. And so this debt that we owe is never going to be repaid. We are called upon always to love, to go that second mile, to turn that other cheek. A number of weeks ago, I talked about how this kind of living is a high cost. And it most certainly is. Because, see, now we've been called to live at a much deeper level. But listen to this. You see, this love of God that transforms us, this is the world that God eventually is going to bring to its ultimate fulfillment. This is the world in which all of us now, we just get this little bit of a taste. But one day, it says there's going to be no more sorrow and pain, no more conflict, no more dealing with this angst in a world that is just so broken. And a brokenness that just causes us to groan within ourselves. No. See, this love, God says, is the motivating force of one's life. It defines our relationship with Him. It should define our relationship with our neighbor. And when there is those sense of conflicts, you and I are going to have to rise above those circumstances, because love isn't just about sentiment. Love is about action. And it's action that is targeted to the other, to my neighbor. A few weeks ago, I used an illustration from Malcolm Gladwell's book called David and Goliath. Underdogs, Misfits, and the Art of Battling Giants. Malcolm Gladwell, best-selling author of a book called Tipping Point, Blink, a number of really thought-provoking books. I read this at the beginning of this year, back in January. It was in an article, and this is a story that was told. It says that Malcolm Gladwell went to Winnipeg to visit a woman named Wilma Dirksen. 30 years ago, the Dirksons experienced what one can only imagine as a parent's worst nightmare. Their daughter was abducted and murdered. Gladwell was amazed by something that Wilma said at the time. Quote, this is what she said: "We would like to know who the person or persons who murdered Candace are, so we could share, hopefully, a love that seems to be missing in these people's lives. I can't say at this point I forgive this person." But Gladwell noticed that the stress was on the phrase, "at this point." Gladwell writes, "I wanted to know where the Dirksons found the strength to say these things. Where do two people find the power to forgive in a moment like that?" He said the answer was in their Christian faith. It's a power that Gladwell, who grew up in a Christian home, was familiar with but had gotten away from. He said, "I have always believed in God. I have grasped the logic of the Christian faith. What I have had a hard time seeing is God's power." Sitting in Wilma Dirkson's garden, he saw that power. He realized that the louder claims of material advantage and the world's ideas about power had him looking in the wrong places. Seeing God's power in action led him to rediscover his Christian faith. See, that's why this call to love God with all my faculties and to love my neighbor as myself is not just having a transforming effect on me, putting my mind and my heart more on the center of what God wants for us. But that kind of a life becomes a light that shines in darkness. That kind of life is a life that brings God glory. That life is what will break down sometimes those encumbrances and obstacles that people have erected that keep them away from God. But when they see you loving from the heart, for no other reason than you are motivated by a love that God has shown for you, then that's a game changer. See, that's why the sixth step, it says this, it says, I am to evaluate all my relationships. I am to offer forgiveness to those who have hurt me and make amends for harm I've done to others, except when to do so would harm them or others. You see, this next step, it's all about this transformation that takes place in me. But when this transformation takes place in me, I now look at the state of those relationships that I am engaged in. And if I'm honest, I recognize that there are moments that I misspoke, I misstepped, I have done harm. And while I may wish that I can have like an eraser and go back and erase those mistakes, where I can undo those knots that I've tangled, I recognize that now God is asking me to go back and with humility of heart to ask for forgiveness. And He's also asking me to go into those areas to offer forgiveness. This is this change that God is doing in you and me. And so this step is such an important one because it's not just about the forgiveness that we extend. You are only going to be able to extend that kind of forgiveness, that kind of grace, if centered in your life is an issue that must be settled, and that is that I am choosing to love God with all of my heart, with all of my mind, with all my soul, with all my strength. And from that position, I go out to love my neighbor as myself. That's a position of power. That's a position of transformation. That is another step in finding the me that was created in the image of God. Let's pray. Father, I thank you for an opportunity that we have to open up this word together, to speak to you about issues, Lord, that are so close to our hearts. Perhaps those who have heard this message this morning, they might take a reflective look and begin to find ways to make amends, to offer this grace that we've experienced. These are not easy things to do. These tangled relationships are part of life. And when we go back, Lord, the only answer for the evil around us is your love. And so we give ourselves to that. It becomes our living sacrifice to you, to be instruments of reconciliation, ambassadors of hope. And Lord, we'll be careful to give you all the praise. In Jesus' name, amen.